Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. There we hello, my name's Tim. I'm the minister here, and we're doing a sermon series on worship. We're in the fifth week. You've got me for one more week. Thanks for the chair. And this week we're doing In the Temple Part 2. But it's an odd thing. I was thinking about it when I was prepping for this. How odd it is that in churches, you go into churches, and when we think about sung worship, there's a heck of a lot of time singing. Whether it is kind of songs like we've just sung, or whether it's hymns, or whether it's kind of chant kind of things, there's a lot of time focused around singing. And then if you look kind of outside of the church, there's actually very little time and occasion when we sing. If you've been watching the Rugby World Cup, feel free to join in. Sam and Rory especially. Is he here? No. Darn it. Mary, feel free to join in. Swing low. Come on, Sam, sing up. Yeah, sweet chariot. There we go. The glorious hymn for everybody who's Scottish and Welsh, not. But there's these weird places where we do sing. And if you think about it as well, it's like kind of, we're prepping for our Ben going off to university. And when Jake left, but he came back, we prepped for him a book of all his favourite recipes and how to cook them and tips for life. And so we did the same thing for Ben. All his favourite recipes and how to cook them. But when it comes to Ben, it's probably who to hand it to cook for him. And tips for life. And one of the tips for life that I added in was always have a karaoke go-to song. And it is true. The thing is, you don't want to be the guy or the girl who sits at a karaoke bar and never gets up and sings. You don't want to be the curmudgeonly one. You've got to have a song. And I can see nodding for people who aren't that adventurous, but there's always a song, if your arm is twisted, that you'll get up and sing. It's part of life. It's a top tip for life. Mine's an Elvis one. Oh, yeah, it is. We're caught in a rut. I can't let go. Oh, thank you. There we go. I'm not singing any more of that. I had to write the words down. Do you get that? There we go. That's how important this talk is. I don't write my talk down, but then I do. So we always have that. But it's bizarre, the singing that goes on, either external to a church or internal to a church, where we don't sing, but we kind of sing in odd situations. You come into a church where there's lots of singing. And that's kind of want to kind of start the idea that actually, why is this? And we've looked a little bit at a history of worship. We've looked at we've got the aims and the ideas behind. We're going to learn a bit about worship, renew our hearts for it, refocus our whole lives around the idea of worship. Hopefully, through this, get a deeper, more intimate understanding of worship. A whole life approach to worship. So it's not just on Sundays. We take that passion, we take that time, we take that urge to want to sing together and take it out into the world and explore the idea that worship is more than just singing. And finally, hopefully, to model and encourage that in others. The first week we looked at this idea of before creation in theology. There was an idea that there was a song sung over us. That the presence of God hovered over the waters of chaos. And this is a picture of what the temple was like. This bronze laver, this bronze pool that was huge, and just various theories as to why it was there. But one of the key most creative ways of looking at it is that it shows creation. It shows what was before creation, this idea of fear and chaos and water, and that actually what we've got to leave behind in our chaos in our lives before we can enter into a time of worship with God. So what chaos do we need to leave behind before we can worship? Second week, we looked at the idea of the tabernacle in the desert and the focus around that community, that actually the priority for the whole thing wasn't setting up your tent or cooking the tea. It was setting up the presence of God amongst the people. And so what is our desert, and where does our world fit around our worship? Not where does our worship fit around our world. The priority has to be the presence of God amongst us. And the following week, we looked at this idea of count yourself dead to sin. The idea that God has done the work. Sin is forgiven. We are able to go into his presence. How does that work out in our lives? And then last week, it's a picture, if you weren't here last week, that is a picture of the closest point underneath the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem where you will get before you can get to the Holy of Holies. And this tour guide who took us there, and she couldn't even bring herself to touch that point, which was so holy and special to the Jewish people. And then when we worship, we're in the presence of God. If we aren't sent out, it's pretty pointless. Worship just becomes this self-centered, self-saving activity rather than an activity that comes from God out into the world. So what I want to do this week is look at the kind of second side of the bit of the temple, not necessarily well, yes, kind of what happens when we get it right, but also what might happen if our worship is not right. So we're going to come at that by looking at Luke chapter 8. So if you open your Bibles to page 1037. There's plenty of Bibles knocking around. If you open it so you can see that what I'm saying is written there rather than just making it up. And we're going to read Luke chapter 8, starting to read at verse 26. They sailed to the region of the Gerasenes, which is across the lake from Galilee. When Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a demon-possessed man from the town. For a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but had lived in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had commanded the impure spirit to come out of the man. Many times he had seized him, and though he was chained hand and foot and kept under guard, he had broken the chains and been driven by the demon into solitary places. Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had gone into him. And they begged Jesus repeatedly to order them to go to the abyss. A large herd of pigs were feeding there on the hillside. The demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs, and he gave them permission. When the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. When those tending the pigs saw what had happened, they ran off, reported it to his town in the countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone out sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured. Then all the people of the region of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them because they were overcome with fear. So he got into the boat and left. The man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return home and tell how much God had done for you." So the man went away and told all over the town how much Jesus had done for him. So we're going to start at the end of this account. If you fast forward to the end, we've just read it, the direction from Jesus. This man had just been healed. He just had his life totally and utterly transformed. He was living with dead people naked. People feared him. He was chained up. He broke it. People ran away for him. His life was transformed. I can't imagine that situation, but I can have a glimpse of it when you think he so must have wanted to follow Jesus. But the command for Jesus was basically, go home and tell how much God has done for you. So point number one goes back to the previous weeks we've looked at. This idea when we engage with a living God, when we meet Jesus, and we have this transforming experience, the first thing he does is he sends him home. So when we have this engaging meet with Jesus on a Sunday, we're sent home. We're sent out into the world to tell people what God has done for you. When the worship goes right, when the temple, when 216 worship space is right, first priority should be to go and tell people what God has done for you. Second thing, if we look at the context of what happened just before, flip to the previous page, 1037, we see the account of Jesus calming the storm. One day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go to the other side of the lake." So they all got into the boat and set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake, so that the boat was being swamped and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." He got up, rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided and all was calm. "Where is your faith?" he asked his disciples. In fear and amazement, they asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." Again, previous weeks, water is a place of fear in 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. It is not something that's beautiful. It is something to fear. You can get a living from it, but storms happen, and they happen quickly. When I was living there 20-odd years ago, I was up in Galilee, and a storm came. It was a beautiful day. The storm appeared, and then it went. It is really, really weird, and I'm sure meteorologists can explain the reasons why, but imagine it happening 2,000 years ago. You're on a boat, you're a fisherman, you're sitting there, all of a sudden it kicks off. And this man you spent some time with suddenly has the power to stop that. This man is to be feared. This wonderful context of this story, you think, well, this amazing dramatic thing happening that Jesus takes control of the wind and the rain and the sea and everything going around him. You think, oh, let's have a bit of downtime. Nope, next up, demon-possessed naked man jumps onto the scene. There's no stopping him. The point of fear goes from water into a man who cannot be controlled. The context we're sitting in is a man, Jesus, is in control. It is not, the outside isn't to be feared, he is to be feared. And the final point, verse 28, in the context we've read, when he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice. Jesus basically had done nothing. He'd stepped out of the boat, and this man went mad, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torture me." When we engage with a living Jesus, when we engage with a God who wants to engage with this, in the presence of God, demons tremble. Worship is more than just singing. Worship is an encounter with God out of which there are fruits. Some of it is amazing and transformative. Other bits, a little bit scary. But this is what we should expect when worshipful people step out into the world. The thing is, when it doesn't work, what happens? When worshipful people don't step out into the world, when worshipful people take their eyes off God, what happens? Well, we've only got to read the Old Testament and the New Testament and search through church history, and we'll see the answer to what happens when we take our eyes off God. What happens is the presence of God becomes a building. It forgets that actually God is in it. Throughout the whole of the Old Testament, there's constant focus not on God, it goes on to the building. That never happens in this country, does it? The focus of God becomes less God and more about a building. When it's not working, the presence of God becomes our liturgy, not the God that is supposed to be helping access him. If we forget that, the liturgy becomes more important. Never happens in this country. When the presence of God becomes the songs we sing. If anybody knows, that's Chris Sabin, an amazing worship leader who looks like he's just to do a part on Sesame Street, if you look at that picture. But when we forget God, it becomes more about the songs and less about him. When the presence of God becomes the fuzzy, warm feeling we get when we sing, rather than the God that sent that feeling. This happens throughout the Bible. It happens throughout history. The presence of God becomes the next thing, whatever that may be. It is when eyes go off him, we get easily distracted. So what is the presence of God doing in our lives? Is the thing become our focus? Have we lost sight of the God and we look at the thing instead, whatever that is, whether it's the song, whether it's the building, whether it's a liturgy, whether it's the person, whether it's the theologian, it becomes the thing and not God. Are we called to worship and sing on a Sunday, but forget that we're sent out? Or actually, the final, probably the hardest bit to realize, is that we forget that we are at war. A very spiritual, physical war with the principalities and powers of this world. The war that happened when Jesus stepped out into this area, just stepped off a boat, and a man started shouting and screaming. There is a battle going on between good and evil. I was reminded a few weeks ago, just before I think it was either during the service or just before the service, and actually reminded that actually in the Old Testament, the worshippers were sent out in front because they were there to point towards the one person who was going to win them the battle. They were pointing to God and no one else. So what is the presence of God doing in our lives? Is it more than just a song? Is it more than just a building? Is it more than just a liturgy? Is it more than just the person we like reading? As soon as we take our eyes off it, it becomes those things and not God. So we're going to finish this bit by a little bit shorter than normal, but we're going to finish a bit as a kind of almost like an act of confession of where we have lost the focus of God. And we're going to do it, we can get the band up. Have we got one more song? Where's Olivia? There she is. We've got one more song. If you can start with a bit of noodling, apparently that's a technical musical term, and we're going to kind of respond in a way of confession. Julia's going to come up and facilitate that, and we're going to focus our eyes on God. We're not going to focus on the song. We're not going to focus on the liturgy. We're not going to focus on the building. We're not going to focus on the next thing. We're going to focus totally and utterly on God. And then Julia's going to send us out.